Hello, my name is Dr. Colin Robertson, and I'm an exercise and nutrition scientist based in the United Kingdom, although much of the work that I'm involved in actually is of a global nature, certainly with regards to global strategies that center upon health. In the not so distant past, I was a member of the Health Innovations Research Team, working really on strategies that were focused here in the UK in what we call the Greater Manchester area, which was looking at aspects of what we call health parity. So how we embed the best health and clinical practices in one area and ensure that they reach all areas so that we have health parity, health equality across an entire district. Now, Health Innovations is actually a global network whereby the scheme is to create this at a local level, but create overlap. So that sure enough, what happens is by creating that level of consistency in care, in standards of clinical, medical, and health practice, what happens is that we foster a relationship around the globe where every area matches the same standard, looks after its own population, but by doing so, we create a global blanket approach. At that same time, and in fact, up until more recently, I was a member of another global strategy, which is called Cities Changing Diabetes. And this was actually centered on the same type of sentiment, which is the notion that we have this global issue with regards to type 2 diabetes. And what we should look at is where people are research active, where their areas of expertise are, how that expertise can lead us towards better, more successful outcomes, and more importantly, certainly from my point of view, how we can start to really interfere and start to prevent more people. Because this is what I'm going to talk to you about today, is type 2 diabetes. I'm going to start by setting some of the context with regards to the disease, establish where we're at in the 21st century with this lifestyle way above 98% preventable disease that has become a pandemic, certainly an epidemic of its own, and then look at some of the considerations that empower us to make different types of choices. As an exercise and nutrition scientist, obviously, I'm going to lead this discussion and hopefully open up a debate that you can continue yourselves in your own time about which the role of diet, the role of how much we move, our exercise orientation, our food choices on a daily basis can either prevent, offset, minimize, or, as I'll get to in the context of pre-diabetes, completely reverse. And so that's what I intend to do. So come with me on this little journey, this little insight into what is actually quite a complex, nuanced, and ever-emerging issue, whilst I set the scene and then perhaps suggest some ways that I think we can do things better. So let's have a look at the epidemiology. Being updated year on year, this data still rings true and sadly paints quite a grim picture. So in 2017, just 6 years ago, there were approximately 462 million individuals that were living with type 2 diabetes, which is equivalent to 6.28% of the world's population. We can see here, and it would be tedious for me to read through every single statistic, but these figures paint an alarming picture of what's really going on with regards to this condition. 4.4% of those were aged 15 to 49, 15% were aged 50 to 69, and 22% were aged 70 plus. So never again allow someone to tell you that type 2 diabetes is a disease of old age. And in fact, more worrisome is the data that tells us that the biggest growth areas are actually those 15 to 49 and 50 to 69 groups. They're the people who it's impacting on more. Over here in the United Kingdom, there wasn't a single case of a child being diagnosed with type 2 diabetes up until 2002. And now ever more cases, a growing percentage, occur every single year, year on year. So this is something we really have to interfere with. And I'll make a statement now that's typically unpopular, but it's true. When a child develops type 2 diabetes, this is an indication of apathy, of a failure of the parent to enforce the word no, to say, no, you can't have that. No, you can't drink 2 liters of fizzy, carbonated, full sugar drink every single day. No, you can't have sugary breakfast cereals. No, you can't have a cake. No, you can't have a biscuit. To excess. And excess creates the burden of a disease. And whilst that can seem like I'm attacking the parent in this, it's not necessarily true, because the real problem we have is the level of understanding and awareness of the parents, because more often than not, what we are dealing with are people who don't actually know any better. They're not willfully sitting back and allowing children to develop a disease. The fact is there's a lack of understanding. There is a lack of knowledge. And often the things that we take for granted shouldn't be taken for granted at all. And so we need to work on this. We need to work on raising people's level of understanding and awareness of the causality of this condition, so that we can work more preventatively and certainly start to dramatically reduce these numbers that affect children. Because either way you look at that, another person who is responsible is involved. Adults, it's up to themselves, and we're actually addressing a different type of problem. Prevalence rate currently is 6,059 cases per 100,000. But if you skip down a few points, you can see that the prediction is that by 2030, we're going to have 7,079. So as we can see, the trajectory for type 2 diabetes is still steadily on the incline. Over 1 million deaths per year attributed to diabetes alone. The burden of diabetes is rising globally, much faster rate in developed regions, such as Western Europe. And that tells us something. That tells us something quite profound, is that when we see a disease that is rampant in the more developed nations, we can see that there is a direct association with the lifestyle behaviors, sedentary activity, lack of physical activity and exercise, but also modifications and changes that have happened to the food and how we consume food. And when we align this to data that shows that 65 to 80% of the average diet across Western Europe, and in fact, Europe as a whole, and certainly here in the UK, and in increasing numbers over in the US, is comprised of ultra-processed foods, which are calorie high, saturated fat high, but nutrient low, we don't need to argue too much about the correlation, cause and effect. We see gender distribution is quite equal, and incidence peaks around the age of 55. There are concerning trends of rising prevalence in lower income countries. And this actually supports my previous statement. Ultra-processed foods are typically very cheap. And when we look at average spend, weekly, monthly spend, particularly for lower income households on food, ultra-processed foods become ever more attractive because they satisfy an emergent energy or perceived energy need. And then we could delve into all this notion of taste bud manipulation and aggressive marketing, but that's not the point of today's talk. But it is a factor. And urgent public health and clinical preventative measures are warranted. And that was actually not my statement, but the outcome of the statement of the research you can see here and his group, Carnetel 2020. So it is time that we started to take this far more seriously. I often describe type 2 diabetes as the pandemic before the pandemic. And now that we've somewhat recovered from the global lockdowns, it's time for us to return our focus to this. And never forget that as an underlying cause and exasperating comorbidity during the COVID lockdowns, people living with type 2 diabetes were put amongst those of the highest risk of the most severe symptoms. So it is time that we actually took the lesson, turned around, and considered how we can be more proactive and have greater impact in this area. Between 2000 and 2016, we see some more alarming figures with regards to the increase in the premature mortality rate. In 2019, estimated 1.5 million deaths were directly caused by diabetes, and another 2.2 million deaths attributed to high blood glucose in 2012. A healthy diet, regular physical activity, maintaining a normal body weight, and avoiding tobacco use are ways to prevent or delay the onset of type 2 diabetes. When we look at pre-diabetes, which we will consider a little bit more in a moment, we know there's already a consensus within the research that at the pre-diabetic stage, we can actually reverse that condition completely. So we can avoid the onset of type 2 diabetes. Once we see those warning signs are in place, and I'll come back to this in a moment, we have to be looking and detecting those warning signs in order for us to acknowledge them. We can actually prevent this altogether. We can see the smoke on the horizon. The important thing is that we start to test more effectively so that we can detect more effectively, and then we can actually get involved and do something about it. It can be treated and its consequences avoided or delayed with diet, physical activity, medication, and regular screening for treatment for complications. I would actually say that this is a part of the problem we have now that leads to the current state of complacency. Because we have a medical model that to some degree can effectively manage this condition, we've become somewhat passive about it. We know we can encourage better behaviors, we can instill a sense of accountability, ask somebody to make some dietary changes and modifications, and we can give them medication. What we don't measure enough, though, is the impact all of this has on quality of life and the lifetime spent, and consider that this might be somebody from teenage years on long-term chronic use of medication. We need to encourage a mindset and a culture about living better. We also need to encourage a mindset and a culture about preventing the preventables. No one should volunteer for disease. And we as a society, our social obligation is to recognize how things go wrong and actually encourage and instill mechanisms to prevent that from happening wherever possible. The good news is that we can. So I've mentioned it already, but let's spend a little bit of time on this HbA1c testing and what that is, what it actually is. So it's where we take an assessment of the blood. And remember, folks, blood is an organ. I think this gets overlooked all too often. And to my mind, and certainly to that of much of the scientific community, it's the organ of organs, because it's the one that it transports oxygen-rich blood to all of the other organs of the body. It's the vital line. It carries nutrients. It's a part of the process of detoxification. And so when we measure something in the blood, it's giving us a clear systemic insight to what is happening with that individual. And that's why medically, clinically, and certainly in my background in sports performance, we use blood measures as a standard, as the go-to method and measure to see where the individual is at, whether that's in a disease condition, whereby we're trying to estimate some type of pathology, or in a performance condition, where we're trying to measure the efficacy of some type of adaptation. When we get back to this HbA1c, what we're looking at is the glycated hemoglobin. So what we're looking at is how well does glucose sugar stick to the red blood cell. The body can't use the sugar properly, so more of it sticks to the red blood cell, and then it builds up in the blood. So HbA1c is literally looking at how sugary the blood has become. And this is an indication of a lack of glycemic control, because it shouldn't be there. These red blood cells are active for around 2 to 3 months. And this is why most HbA1c tests are actually what we call a retrospective analysis. So we're taking a measure of your blood cell today, the assumption being that this blood cell is going to give us an indication of what's happened over the past days, weeks, months, anywhere up to 3 months, because that's the lifespan of the blood cell. And so it gives us an indication of how you've been, and certainly an insight to what type of diet you've been consuming during that time. So a high HbA1c means that a person has too much sugar in their blood. And this means that they are much more likely to develop diabetes and metabolic syndrome, and actually other certain types of non-communicable diseases. But that's not our focus for today. But you can develop also serious problems with your eyes, with your feet, because the blood shouldn't be sugary. Just think of it in simple terms. All too often, Myself and my colleagues can overcomplicate a situation, and we can use scientific language, which can be a barrier for some people. And I know lots of people struggle even with the term HbA1c. So let me just make this simple. It's blood sugar. It's how sugary is your blood, and it shouldn't be. It should be really low. Obviously, sugar itself, glucose, is a form of nutrient. It serves and has a part of a function within the system, creates energy. However, like most things, too much is never a good thing. And in fact, too much leads to what we call insulin, or lack of insulin sensitivity. And this is now when we start to consider the function of the pancreas and those metabolic enzymes, and literally the system no longer able to regulate and do what needs to be done. And so we have, in a sense, a type of organ malfunction, certainly dysfunction. So the benefit of knowing this is that, well, once you test, you know the status of a situation and you can do something about it. This is particularly relevant when it comes to blood sugar, because as I've said, it's this retrospective analysis. It's telling us how you've consumed food and how you've behaved, perhaps over the past 3 months. And our red blood cells, well, they turn over. We have brand new ones pretty much every 120 days. So we can start to change how things will be by changing the things that we do. So once we know what our score is, then we can do something about it. HbA1c should actually be checked regularly, and by regularly, I mean quarterly. So in line with how the test functions, approximately every 3 months. Check your HbA1c. It's a dynamic measure. Now, perhaps that's a little bit unrealistic. And in a situation whereby you've got a good body weight, so you're not dealing with any kind of excessive adiposity, so any fat, you are not, dealing with obesity, then maybe you're going to measure twice a year. Maybe that's going to be the measure, just to check that the way you are, because plenty of slim people develop type 2 diabetes. It's not only associated with being overweight or having obesity, although they are indicators of increased risk. The fact is, it's what's going on biologically, systemically that matters, and that's what we need to measure. So we should check it quarterly. It's considered a vital check and a part of an annual medical review, and that's the problem. Most people only test it once a year, and that's if they turn up and actually attend a medical review every year, which we know less and less people do year on year. And so typically, the only time a person is prompted to undergo a HbA1c test is when they are already exhibiting or experiencing signs and symptoms that would raise their alertness to be concerned about the possibility of type 2 diabetes. And sometimes, by the time those symptoms manifest, it's already too late. If we're lucky, we can capture that at the pre-diabetic stage, but that's not always the case. And in fact, it's quite commonly the case that the moment those symptoms become something that we recognize, we've already tipped past the point. And so testing, taking the opportunity to test, because if you're not testing, you are guessing, gives you a direct insight to a key prime indicator of your overall health status. So we can test it. We know what it is. We know we've got this issue with blood sugar. We know that this in itself is a non-communicable disease. We know that it brings about certain types of complications. It is a restriction to how we can live our life. And also, it is a part of the cause and causality of other dire consequences, and is a gateway disease. So your likelihood of developing something like cardiovascular disease, experiencing a stroke, certain types of cancer, metabolic syndrome are increased if you have type 2 diabetes. That's what we mean by it being a gateway disease. And so what we need to do is close the gate. We want to make sure that we can do something about it. And what we're going to consider now are what are those things that we can do, given the fact that we don't want this huge compromise to our quality of life. So first of all, given that it's so centered upon food and the types of foods we eat, Let's start in the gut, and let's look at the gut microbiota, which is a fascinating space. Anybody who's even took a partial glance at the science in this area will assure you that what we've come to learn and understand over the past 15 years pretty much is an accelerated far beyond what we'd come to understand in the previous 150. And that's because we now have the technological methods, measures, and processes to really gain some useful information from that space, which is hard to reach and hard to access. One of the key things we do know is there's so much more for us to know. But right now we have some real solid, staple understanding that can influence what we do. Increasing evidence suggests that the gut microbiota plays an important role in the pathogenesis of diabetes, and that the relationship between the hyperglycemic agents and the gut microbiota, whilst not fully understood, are drawn into this notion of glycemic control, how well we can control blood sugar, how well we can control sugar as a nutritional agent, and then what's reflected in the function of the pancreas and how that reaches the hemoglobin. So we know that there is a sensitivity within the gut, and this makes perfect sense. We have in the gut those serotonin channels. These are working to identify a type of pathogen, and they either prompt us to vomit or to emit waste in a fecal manner if we engage with something that's poisonous for the system. But when we have foods that literally go in and disturb the biota, remember the biota need to be fed off those essential dietary fibers, and other types of foods, and particularly refined carbohydrates, simple sugars, both destroy, negatively impact the good biota, and what we can see create an environment for the negative biota to multiply and dominate the space. This leads to multiple types of gut disorder, but is also a part of the mechanism in how a person develops type 2 diabetes. What we're seeing, although the research is new and emerging, are positive associations whereby a person starts to really steer their diet towards the inclusion of dietary fibers. So has a daily dietary fiber strategy. Now, typically, you would have to get that source of nutrition from plenty of leafy greens and fruits, vegetables. But we know that this is a ripe area now on a day-to-day basis amongst healthy populations to instill, to embed a strategic and intelligent supplemental strategy. Either way, we know that we can start to win this war against this disease by normalizing the gut, ensuring that there are essential dietary fibers to nurture the gut environment, control that space, feed the essential microbiota, those microbes, those bacteria that work on your behalf. And also remember, 70% of immune function takes place within the gut. So controlling, normalizing, and stabilizing that environment is a surefire way, actually, to work on a preventable sense with regards to a lot of non-communicable diseases. But the early data now and the emerging data is all very, very positively indicating that it's true in the case of type 2 diabetes also. I want to jump now to a specific vitamin, which is vitamin D, because vitamin D gets a lot of attention in a lot of ways. One, because it has a primary and an integral role in immune function. And the way I like to explain this to people is to think of all those nutrients, think of all those vitamins and minerals as the letters of the alphabet that create the language with which your body communicates. And if you are deficient in a letter, that means you are compromised in your choice of words. And if you can no longer use certain words, then your overall communication is compromised. When it comes to vitamin D and you look at the active role it plays in either an immune response or day-to-day immune function, when it's deficient, we see a delay in the system. Sometimes we can see a breakdown in the system. And given the fact, again, if we go back a step, 70% of the immune function being within the gut, And we know that it's dietary mechanisms that have the biggest influence on the development of type 2 diabetes. We've also just considered how we nurture a better gut environment. So now what we see, okay, where does vitamin D play its role in all of this, and whether or not we have sufficient amounts? And what we see is that over the past decade, low vitamin D has emerged as a risk factor for type 2 diabetes. Vitamin D supplementation has been hypothesized as a potential intervention to lower diabetes risk. So we're seeing this now, not with regards to purely how it functions within the immune function response, but targeted towards the reduction and the correction of a specific pathology, in this instance, type 2 diabetes. And observational studies strongly support an inverse association between blood vitamin D level and the risk of developing type 2 diabetes. So what we see is that when type 2 diabetes is sufficient, risk is low. When it's deficient, risk is higher. The seesaw effect, cause correlation, equaling something akin to that cause and effect. And so results from these trials, which there's actually more and more focus on now, certainly since 2020, because of the world waking up to the vital role that vitamin D plays with regards to immune function. And what we're seeing now, there's been a real hotspot of activity in this area. And what we're seeing is that more compellingly, across broader diabetes populations, and particularly pre-diabetes, we can see that there is this positive correlation whereby we reduce risk and in some areas reduce symptoms, and in fact in a pre-diabetes state help to reverse the condition purely by addressing the vitamin D alone. Powerful. We haven't reached the consensus yet, but all indications are moving forward and are very promising, very compelling indeed. So we've gone from this notion of what we're testing, considering, well, what is it we can do? And we've started in the gut, and we've then leapt towards a common vitamin that is associated with immune response. So then what we need to do is unpack this a little bit further. Consider that even if the risk reduction with vitamin E supplementation may appear relatively small, when applied to the expanding pre-diabetes population, it can have important health public implications. Little and often, small things can have big effects, and that's always true in the context of health. And when we're starting to look and steer things that can have a broad, and we are talking about tens of millions of people, population impact. So, from the gut to a key consideration of immune function, maintaining both of those parts, but coming back to the cell, the omega-3, considering the fact that we are, us humans, I'm assuming that I'm speaking to humans, we are a collection of 37 trillion cells that come together as a community of cells for a lifetime. And we know that omega-3 and its counterpart, its partner, omega-6, play such a significant role within the lipid membrane of each one of those 37 trillion cells. And so it's commonly associated with a lot of disease factors. We look at the quality of the cell, first of all, because typically when the cell is in good quality, then we've got the right environment for health to be in the right place too. What we see in the context of omega-3, specifically related to type 2 diabetes, is that elevated triglyceride levels are a common dyslipidemic feature that accompany type 2 diabetes and pre-diabetes states. Fasting triglyceride levels above 150 mg is one of the 5 accepted criteria for defining individuals at high risk for cardiovascular disease and type 2 diabetes. So it doesn't take a genius to figure out the next step. If deficiencies of this essential fat, remember it's essential because we can't produce it ourselves, it's essential because of the role it plays in immune function, the lipid membrane of each and every single one of our cells, it's pro-anti-inflammatory, so it's controlling those inflammatory markers, it plays a metabolic role. When something is that systemic, then of course it plays a part in predicting risk, particularly risk of a disease of a metabolic nature, which type 2 diabetes is. There is also strong evidence that omega-3 fatty acids can significantly reduce blood triglyceride levels. So we can reduce those blood fats. And there also appears to be slight improvement in the high density lipoprotein, the good guys, although an increased level of low density has also been observed by the Mayo Clinic. But remember, and we need to talk about this more, it's the ratio of HDL to LDL. It's the ratio of the good to the bad that matters most, not singularly the total amount. And so, of course, by consuming an essential fat, we would expect to see a change in our fat profiles, particularly those HDL and LDL. But what we consistently see when we look further afield at the wider research is that we get a better ratio. And that's what matters most. Total amount is a part of the equation for sure, but total amount without the context of ratio is almost meaningless. We understand things far better now. So we can see a deficiency correlates to an increased risk. And we also see that we get a reduction in circulating triglyceride levels when omega-3 status is in the right place. So we can already see the important, profound role the omega-3 has on the type 2 diabetes condition. This takes us really towards the end of what I'd like to discuss today. As you might be able to imagine, I could discuss this at length for hours and hours and hours. And in fact, at university, we teach whole modules and courses just around this particular subject. And hopefully what I've done today is raised your awareness and given you something to think about and consider and perhaps consider differently. But what I do want to reassure you of is that everything I've commented on is driven where the latest research is at. That's where this is drawn down from. Now, to conclude our considerations of fat, what I want you to think of is that having excessive adiposity, having excessive body fat, or having obesity are increased risk factors for type 2 diabetes and metabolic syndrome and cardiovascular disease and certain types of cancers. And we need to get to a stage where we recognize globally and identify obesity as a disease condition because it has a pathology. It has a rate at which it's expressed and it's changed and it manifests. We know that it brings with it a host of very predictable compromises and alterations to our health status. And one of those is the adaptor cytokines. Now, these are mediators of insulin resistance. And when we see somebody who is gaining adiposity, gaining weight, or is starting to deal with obesity, then what we see is a change of function and malfunction, dysfunction of the adaptor cytokines. And then we see this lack of insulin resistance. So what happens is we disassociate. This brings about one of the key impacts and effects that determines whether or not we become classified and diagnosed as being type 2 diabetic, which is that lack of glycemic control. We can no longer control those sugars, and our insulin regulation is also desensitized. And so we know just by increasing body fat, we're going to bring about unwanted changes in the function of these adaptor cytokines. So we can get involved. We can start to manage this better. We know that these are significantly regulated by nutritional status. They influence organs, they influence the brain. We can influence them by being more physically active, by engaging in regular and frequent exercise, by making better food choices, by going back a few steps, by making sure we have sufficient dietary fiber, nurturing the gut, by making sure we have sufficient and optimum levels of vitamin D, by ensuring that we have sufficient and optimum levels of omega-3, reducing those circulating triglycerides, normalizing glycemic control, and preserving and maintaining that relationship with insulin. Everything we need to do, everything we need to know is already within our hands. All we need to do now is act on what we know, function accordingly, and start to bring around the change that's needed. When we look at how we change, behavior change is often, for most people, the hardest part of the equation. Transforming what they do and how they do it, their food orientation from one way to another, can be a real challenge. But we know that type 2 diabetes can be controlled through improvements in patients' dietary knowledge, understanding food better, their attitude towards food, what they're prepared to try and what they're prepared to include. More importantly, their practices. Because essentially, we are the outcome of what we do, not the outcome of what we think. It's the choices we make that we act upon, the food choices we make, the physical activity choices we make. And so more often than not, having consulted thousands of people over the year, done one-to-one nutritional consultations, having been part of regional, national, and global strategy groups, what I've come to realize is that unless you can make it easy, you won't make it matter. Unless you can make it convenient, you won't make a change. And yet these factors are considered an integral part of comprehensive diabetes care. Can we change the whole world's attitude about food, fast food, ultra-processed food? I don't know, but I remain hopeful. But what I do know is that when we make doing the right thing easy, there's way more opportunity for more people to do the right thing. So there's a list of some of the references that have informed my discussion with you. It's been a real pleasure for me to be able to discuss something that is such a subject that's close to my heart. And I hope it's provided some food for thought without any joke intended. And I hope that what you will do off the back of this is, first of all, consider some changes that you might make. More importantly, consider the changes that you will encourage and advocate, maybe amongst your family, your friends, your patients. But either way, carry the message forward, pay attention, raise your awareness, and together, let's do something about it.